In the 1990s, hip-hop wasn't just music, it was a battlefield. Record labels were empires. Artists were soldiers, and behind the microphone, the real war was being fought by two powerful men, Suge Knight of Death Row Records and Diddy Combs of Bad Boy Entertainment. This is the untold story of their ruthless rivalry, a power struggle that turned the golden era of hip-hop into one of the most dangerous times in music history. To understand how this all began, you first have to know the men themselves. Suge Knight, born Marion Hugh Knight Jr., grew up in Compton, California. A former college football player, Suge had size, strength, and a reputation for intimidation. By the early 1990s, he turned that aggression into business power, founding Death Row Records. Death Row quickly became a West Coast powerhouse, signing Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac Shakur. Their music didn't just top the charts, it terrified the mainstream with raw tales of gang life, violence, and survival. Suge wasn't just running a record label. He was running an empire that blurred the line between music and the streets. On the opposite coast was Sean Puffy Combs, later known as Diddy. Born in Harlem and raised in Mount Vernon, Puffy was sharp, stylish, and busy. He founded Bad Boy Records in 1993, pushing acts like the Notorious B.I.G, Maze, and Faith Evans. Where Suge ruled through fear, Puffy ruled through flash. Where Death Row was street and dangerous, Bad Boy was shiny suits, champagne, and radio hits. They were complete opposites, but they wanted the same throne. The music industry only had room for one king, and these two titans were on a collision course. The moment their rivalry exploded into the open came at the 1995 Source Awards. That night, hip-hop's biggest stars filled Madison Square Garden. The tension between the East Coast and West Coast was already high, but Suge Knight decided to make it public. On stage, in front of thousands, he took a direct shot at Puffy by saying, "Any artist out there that wanna be an artist, and wanna stay a star, and don't wanna have the executive producer all in the videos, all on the records, dancing, come to Death Row." The crowd erupted. It was a direct insult to Puffy's habit of dancing in his artist videos. What seemed like a jab was really a declaration of war. That single moment drew a line in the sand, and everyone in hip-hop knew which side they were on. Behind the scenes, this rivalry was about far more than music. It was about money, power, and respect. Suge Knight surrounded himself with members of the Bloods. His reputation for violence was legendary. From alleged beatdowns in studios to intimidation tactics with artists and executives, Suge made sure Death Row's name carried weight. Meanwhile, Puffy built alliances in New York. He had corporate connections, media power, and Biggie as his weapon. Bad Boy dominated radio airwaves while Death Row ruled the streets. The competition wasn't just about record sales, it was about who would control the future of hip-hop. The rivalry took on a new dimension when Tupac Shakur entered the picture. In 1995, Tupac was locked up, facing serious charges. Suge Knight saw an opportunity. He bailed Tupac out reportedly with a $1.4 million bond in exchange for signing him to Death Row Records. With Tupac on board, Death Row gained not just a superstar, but a soldier in Suge's war against Puffy and Bad Boy. Tupac wasted no time making his allegiance clear. He publicly accused Puffy and Biggie of setting him up in a 1994 New York studio shooting. On records like Hit 'Em Up, Tupac didn't just diss Bad Boy, he declared war. The beef wasn't just label versus label anymore. It was personal, it was public, and it was deadly. By 1996, hip-hop was split down the middle. You were either with Death Row or Bad Boy. Death Row had Tupac, Snoop Dogg, and Dr. Dre, although Dre would later walk away. Bad Boy had Biggie, Maze, and Puff. The media fueled the flames. Every diss track, every rumor, every magazine cover pushed the feud deeper. Fans on both coasts picked sides. What started as music became a cultural divide. And through it all, Suge and Puffy were pulling the strings. Both men were determined to be the most powerful figure in hip-hop, no matter the cost. The war soon turned tragic. On September 7, 1996, Tupac Shakur was gunned down in Las Vegas after a Mike Tyson fight. He died 6 days later. Suge Knight was in the car with him. The murder shocked the world, but it didn't end the violence. Just 6 months later, on March 9, 1997, the Notorious B.I.G. was murdered in Los Angeles. Two of the greatest rappers of all time gone within months. Two coastlines left in mourning. And in the shadows, the names Suge Knight and Sean Combs lingered. To this day, questions remain. Was Tupac's murder retaliation against Bad Boy? Was Biggie's killing payback against death row, or were both men pawns in a much larger game, involving gangs, police, and money? The truth has never been fully revealed. The deaths of Tupac and Biggie marked the end of an era. Death Row Records began to collapse under Suge's legal troubles. He was eventually sentenced to prison on multiple charges, and his empire crumbled. Bad Boy Records survived, but Puffy changed direction. He reinvented himself as Diddy, focusing more on business, fashion, and television. While Bad Boy continued to release hits, the label never fully escaped the shadow of the East Coast versus West Coast war. The so-called golden era of hip-hop had come to a bloody end, leaving scars that remain to this day. The legacy of the Suge Knight versus Diddy feud is complicated. It was more than just a rivalry. It was a battle for hip-hop's soul. Suge Knight represented raw street power, intimidation, and control. Diddy represented corporate polish, image, and mainstream appeal. Together they built hip-hop into a billion-dollar industry, but at a devastating cost. The feud set the blueprint for future rivalries in music, from 50 Cent versus Ja Rule to Drake versus Meek Mill, but no feud has ever come close to the violence and cultural impact of Suge versus Puffy, even decades later. The same questions remain. Could Tupac and Biggie have lived if Suge and Puffy weren't at war? Did the labels manipulate their artists into becoming soldiers for their empires? And what would hip-hop look like today if peace, not power, had been the goal? We may never know the answers. What we do know is that the Suge Knight versus Diddy rivalry defined an era. It shaped the sound, the culture, and the business of hip-hop. But it also left behind a trail of blood, broken lives, and unanswered questions. This wasn't just music. This was war.